Hello. We have been discussing about the paper on environmental ethics, which is floated in our Delhi University 7th semester as a part of GE from the Department of Philosophy. And we have been discussing how the three central ecofeminists like Vandana Shiva, Bandyopadhyay from the Oriental and Caroline Marchant from the Occidental have had a dialogue or their contribution to this very theme of environmental ethics, and we would be picking up more on this part today. This is Dr. Ananya Barua, Associate Professor in the Department of Philosophy, Hindu College. So, we had been discussing about ecofeminists and their critiques and how the three of these central ecofeminists have picked up nature. If someone thinks that nature, for example, Bandyopadhyay talks that the entire agenda of something called the Chipko movement had arisen because for political or policy injustice, resource marginalization and local governance issues. We see that Vandana Shiva talks that nature is embodied and it's spiritual, gendered and material. And she's clear that women's labor can be connected directly to cycles of nature. And also we had seen how for Vandana Shiva, nature has been a living energy or active subject. Now, having said this, we are in a good position to check how is Vandana Shiva and J. Bandyopadhyay differ from Caroline Marchant in their take on ecofeminism. Firstly, let's see their differences epistemologically. Caroline Marchant critiques scientific epistemology. Vandana Shiva promotes indigenous women's epistemology. Bandyopadhyay, on the other hand, uses ecological political epistemology. So we see that Marchant focuses on worldviews, Vandana Shiva on embodied lived knowledge, Bandyopadhyay on empirical evidence and governance structures, and Caroline Marchant's critique is historical. Whereas Vandana Shiva's is civilizational, and at best we can say Bandyopadhyay's critique is institutional. Now, when we look at it ontologically, we see that Caroline Marchant's ontology is macro-historical, which is organic versus mechanistic. Vandana Shiva's ontology, on the other hand, can be categorized as cosmological, where Prakriti is taken as a living reality. Bandyopadhyay's, on the other hand, her ontology is systematic, which is a combination or a culmination of ecology plus institutions. So we see that for Caroline Marchant, there has been a philosophical archaeology of modernity. For Vandana Shiva, it is a civilization and moral challenge to development, and for Bandyopadhyay, it is the structural, functional analysis of resource policies. So all these three thinkers, they point towards something, and what is it? Let us see the analytical summary of this. All these three thinkers offer distinct but complementary ways of theorizing environmental movements like Chipko. Caroline Marchant explains how domination of women, nature, became epistemologically possible. Vandana Shiva explains why women resist and how nature is ontologically alive. And Bandyopadhyay explains what structural conditions generate conflict and how institutions must change. Thus, Marchant gives the genealogy of domination, Vandana Shiva gives the moral cosmological critique of domination, and Bandyopadhyay gives the political ecological analysis of domination. So, for Marchant, we see that she provides the philosophical and historical genealogy of how nature and women came to be dominated. For Vandana Shiva, she provides the moral, spiritual and political critique of contemporary capitalist patriarchal development. For Bandyopadhyay, she provides the structural, empirical and policy-based analysis of environmental conflicts like CHIPCO. Together, they form a three-layered philosophical architecture. Marchant is clearly the epistemological origins, Caroline Marchant. Vandana Shiva is more on the moral and cosmological resistance, and Bandyopadhyay is, of course, the structural and institutional explanations. Now, if we look at the PPT as being displayed here, we see that there are various dimensions. All in all, there are 30 dimensions that had been picked up to make our analysis today complete to understand these three key thinkers. Number one, we see dimension, the primary framework, Caroline Marchant, is ecofeminist history of ideas. Vandana Shiva's is ecofeminist activism and indigenous cosmology, and J. Bandyopadhyay's is political ecology and resource governance. The central question, Marchant asks, how did Western mechanistic thought legitimize domination? For Shiva, the question is, how do women resist ecological and economic violence? For Bandyopadhyay, the question is, how do policies, institutions, and resource use patterns shape ecological conflicts? The methodology in three of them is again interesting. For Caroline Marchant, it is historical, epistemic analysis. For Vandana Shiva, it is experiential, embodied activist methodology, and for Bandyopadhyay, it is empirical, structural, interdisciplinary analysis. Further, if we talk about the type of ecofeminism, we see that for Marchant, it is historical or cultural ecofeminism. Shiva's is spiritual or material ecofeminism, and Bandyopadhyay's is not ecofeminist per se, but political ecology we can bring her under. View of the modern science, for Marchant, it is the critique of mechanistic science. For Shiva, it is the deep critique of Western science as patriarchal and violent. For J. Bandyopadhyay, it is critical but pragmatic. She sees science as a tool shaped by institutions. Now, the role of women. We see that for Marchant, it is symbolic victims of mechanistic domination. For Vandana Shiva, they are the central agents with ecological wisdom. For Bandyopadhyay, they are the key stakeholders but not ontologically privileged. About the knowledge system or the ecological knowledge system, we see for Caroline Marchant, it is historical worldviews and cosmologies. Vandana Shiva, it is indigenous local women's knowledge. Bandyopadhyay is a mixed expert ecology plus local knowledge plus economics. Epistemology, for Marchant, it is clearly historical reconstruction of paradigms. For Shiva, it is embodied indigenous experiential gendered. For Bandyopadhyay, it is empirical data driven policy based. The ontology of nature, we see that for Caroline Marchant, it has been organic, mechanistic shift, nature historically being constructed. For Vandana Shiva, nature as living, creative, self-organizing, which is Prakriti. And for Bandyopadhyay, nature as a socio-ecological system. When we talk about the human-nature relationship, we see that for Marchant, it is defined by the dominant worldview. For Vandana Shiva, it is direct, embodied, spiritual, ethical relation. And for Bandyopadhyay, it is the functional institution mediated by resource flows. The concept of domination, Caroline, it begins with mechanistic worldview. For Vandana Shiva, it begins with colonial capitalist patriarchy, and for Bandyopadhyay, it begins with state policy and institutional failure. Role of capitalism, for Marchant, it is secondary emphasis. For Vandana Shiva, it is central. Capitalist patriarchy destroys ecology, and for Bandyopadhyay, it is important but mediated through state policies. The development critique, Caroline Marchant critiques of scientific industrial worldview. For Vandana Shiva, is a strong anti-development critique, and is corporate science. For Bandyopadhyay, it is the critique of top-down development, calls for decentralized governance. The role of colonialism for Caroline Marchant is less explicit, more about Western modernity. For Vandana Shiva, it is central, colonial exploitation of women/ecology. For Bandyopadhyay, important, but emphasizes on post-colonial forest governance. Nature's value, we see that for Caroline Marchant, it is ethical and historical. For Vandana Shiva, it is intrinsic, sacred, life-giving. For Bandyopadhyay, it is ecological services plus livelihood value. When we talk about environmental ethics, for Caroline Marchant, it is ecofeminist ethics grounded in worldview. For Vandana Shiva, it is care ethics, earth, democracy, non-violence. And for Bandyopadhyay, it is ecological justice, equitable resource access. About political orientation, Caroline Marchant talks about the critique of modernity. Vandana Shiva is about anti-globalization and pro-subsistence. And we see about Bandyopadhyay, she holds the view of political orientation as decentralized democratic governance. Now, when it comes to spirituality, Caroline Marchant values pre-modern organic worldview. Vandana Shiva is a strong or puts strong emphasis on Prakriti, Shakti, sacred ecology. Bandyopadhyay is minimal and she is secular analysis. Environmental ethics, thus, for Caroline Marchant, is that where ecofeminist ethics is grounded in worldview. For Vandana Shiva, it is care ethics, earth, democracy, non-violence, and for Bandyopadhyay, it is the ecological justice, equitable resource access. The political orientation, of course, there is a critique of modernity for Marchant. For Shiva, it is anti-globalization, pro-subsistence, which already have been discussed. Now, when we talk about the agency of local communities, we see that Caroline Marchant is, she theoretically acknowledges it. Vandana Shiva, on the other hand, for her, women are as primary agents of resistance. And Bandyopadhyay says that communities as multi-actor systems is how they see the agency of local communities. Now, about the view of resistance movements, Marchant talks that it is symbolic return to organic worldview. For Vandana Shiva, it is embodied ecological defense originating in women's labor, and for Bandyopadhyay, it is the rational response to policy injustice and resource scarcity. About the explanation of Chipko, we see that for Caroline Marchant, it is moral revolt against mechanistic explanation. Shiva, it is women defending life, ecology, survival, and for Bandyopadhyay, it is the policy failure plus socio-economic marginalization. Further, when we talk about the analytic skill, we see that Caroline Marchant is all about macro-historical, for she is from Europe. Vandana Shiva is from India, and hers is civilizational plus local, and Bandyopadhyay again is local plus policy and institutional. Role of economy for Marchant is peripheral, but for Shiva it is central critique of capitalist extraction, and for Bandyopadhyay it is the central analysis of resource economics. The critique of state for Caroline Marchant is implicit in critique of mechanistic governance. For Vandana Shiva, it is the strong critique of patriarchal development state, and for Bandyopadhyay, it is the detailed critique of forest bureaucracy and centralization. From the role of technology, we see that for Caroline Marchant, it is a part of mechanistic paradigm. For Vandana Shiva, it is Western technology as destructive. For Bandyopadhyay, it is definitely technology as neutral, depends on policy and social context. Causality of ecological crisis, we see that Marchant's epistemic shift from mechanistic revolution. Vandana Shiva's is patriarchal capitalism plus colonial modernity, and Bandyopadhyay's is misgovernance plus institutional design failures. Relation to global north, global south. For Caroline Marchant, it focuses on Western thought. For Vandana Shiva, it is South-centered and critiques Western dominance. And Bandyopadhyay comes across as a balanced comparative governance perspective. Also, we have the solutions envisioned, where Caroline Marchant talks about the reintegrating organic worldview. Vandana Shiva talks about the earth democracy, women-led ecological governance, and Bandyopadhyay talks about the decentralized community-based resource management. The key contribution, therefore, for Marchant, it is historical genealogy of domination of nature or women. For Vandana Shiva, it is linking ecology, gender, and anti-globalization struggles. And last but not the least, for Bandyopadhyay, it is policy analysis of ecological conflicts, institutional alternatives. Now, from the criticism's point of view, we see that for Caroline Marchant, she romanticizes the pre-modern organic unity a little too much. For Vandana Shiva, it is the essentializing of women or idealizing the subsistence. And for Bandyopadhyay, it is the less attention to gender and risks technocratic tone. So we see that these three thinkers had been picked up today to discuss how they are distinct and different. Nevertheless, they all march together as being celebrated as ecofeminists. Now, in this lecture further, we would be picking up two more articles from Dale Jamieson's and Robert Elliot's work on environmental ethics, which is a part of the recommended readings on environmental ethics. And these two articles will give us further insight as to what is environmental ethics. Now, Dale Jamieson's article is entitled as Ethics and the Environment, and Robert Elliot's article is entitled as Environmental Ethics, and his famous argument is in faking nature. Now, these are the two distinct projects in environmental philosophy. Although both are leading analytic environmental ethicists, they offer very different philosophical orientations. Dale Jamieson, who is broad ethical theories addressing uncertainty, climate change, responsibility, values, and moral psychology. And there is also Robert Elliot, foundational metaphysics and ethics of nature, authenticity, restoration, and intrinsic value. Where Jamieson is normative, forward-looking, and action-oriented, Elliot is ontological, conceptual, and purity-oriented. Further, when we talk about the philosophical foundations, we see that for Dale Jamieson, who is pragmatic analyst ethicist, he focuses on moral responsibility, values pluralism and climate ethics, and is concerned with how humans act in a world of uncertainty, collective action problems, and global change. On the other hand, Elliot is a metaphysical realist about nature, is a strong advocate of intrinsic value, authenticity, and non-anthropocentric ethics. He is known for his critique of restoration ecology as faking nature. Now, let's get it started. For the view of environmental problems, Jamieson is very clear. He says that environmental problems arises from moral failures, from institutional failures, from cognitive biases, from limited moral frameworks, and global complexity. He focuses on climate change as the paradigmatic challenge. Elliot, on the other hand, talks about environmental harm arises from the loss of original natural value. He says that restoration cannot erase the ontological damage. And he says, quote, once destroyed, original nature cannot be replaced. Now, if we talk about the ontological differences or the nature of reality, and ontology, as we understand, is what kind of thing is nature, what is the being of natural entities, and so on and so forth. For ontology of nature, for Jamieson, for him, nature is dynamic, interdependent, and co-constituted with humans. He rejects a rigid human-nature dualism. The Anthropocene complicates the concept of naturalness. Thus, his ontology is flexible, relational, and anthropocentric or anthropocene aware. On the other hand, for Elliot, nature has original authenticity. Its value is derived from being unmanipulated. Ontologically, it distinguishes original nature and restored nature. Restored nature is ontologically inferior. It does not possess the same pristine history or integrity. And ontologically, Elliot is an essentialist, authenticity-based, and historical. So, the ontology of environmental, they say that when we talk about environmental harm, Jamieson is clear that harm or environmental harm is equivalent to suffering. It is equivalent to loss of value. It is equivalent to climate injustice. Environmental harm is also equivalent to disruption of systems. Reality is processual. Harm is assessed through consequences and moral psychology. For Elliot, environmental harm is equivalent to ontological destruction, which is irreplaceable loss of original nature. Fake landscapes lack the history, dependent properties of real nature. The epistemological differences again, now that we have done the ontological differences, we see epistemology again, what counts as environmental knowledge, how do we know that it is valuable. The source of environmental knowledge for Jamieson is ethical reasoning, social science, climate science, psychology, interdisciplinary evidence, future risk prediction. He emphasizes interdisciplinarity and moral imagination. For Elliot, it is axiological reasoning, which is value-based theory, metaphysical inquiry, conceptual analysis, historical knowledge of landscapes, and his epistemology is more philosophical, conceptual, and case-based than empirical. So, what is the way of understanding the value theory? For Jamieson, value is plural, complex, and contextual. Anthropocentric and non-anthropocentric values can coexist. What is a critique of moral monism? Elliot says that value is intrinsic, objective, history-dependent. Thus, original nature is equivalent to ontologically being valuable. Restoration, doesn't matter how much of damage, repair one tries to do, it just simply cannot go back to that pristine state or cannot recreate the intrinsic value because history cannot be replicated. Certainty versus uncertainty. For Jamieson, he works extensively with uncertainty, climate models, future harms, and argues ethics must function under uncertainty. For Elliot, he is less concerned with uncertainty. He works with conceptual certainty, which is destroyed nature is ontological laws, and restoration cannot eliminate these laws. Further, the ethical theory differences. Now, the type of ethics for Jamieson, it is a hybrid of consequentialism, virtue ethics, and moral psychology, ethical creativity and responsibility in the Anthropocene. For Elliot, it is deontological, axiological ethics. Moral obligations arise from intrinsic value and authenticity. The moral motivation for Jamieson is the focus on moral emotions, empathy, compassion. Moral failures arise because climate change diffuses responsibility. Elliot, on the other hand, talks about moral motivation arising from recognition of nature's value and authenticity. We must not fake nature. Anthropocentrism versus non-anthropocentrism for Jamieson. He is a soft non-anthropocentrism. Human values matter, but not exclusively, and he's very clear on that. For Elliot, it is strong non-anthropocentrism, where for him, value is independent of humans. That is, humans do not decide the value of nature. Further, when we talk about the views on environmental restoration, Jamieson says that it is open to restoration as long as it creates value, biodiversity and justice. He is pragmatic, where he says that, quote, "We must work with the world we have," unquote. For Elliot, restoration is equivalent to aesthetic substitution, moral deception, and ontological damage cannot be undone. Is a strong critique in faking nature. The political philosophy and policy for Jamieson, it is climate governance, global cooperation, individual versus collective responsibility. Ethics must reshape institutions and behavior. For Elliot, it does not focus on political theory. It is concerned with protecting a natural heritage from further destruction. Now in this PPT here, we see that there are various dimensions of the views of Jamieson and Elliot. The philosophical style, for one, is pragmatic analytic ethics, for the other it is metaphysical analytic ethics. The central focus, for one, is climate change and morality, for the other it is authenticity and intrinsic value. About ontology, it is dynamic and relational for the former, essentialist and historical for the latter. Epistemology is interdisciplinary for the first, and for the second it is conceptual, historic, intrinsic, objective. Value theory is pluralistic for the one, intrinsic, objective for the other. Restoration ethics, Jamieson accepts cautiously, Elliot strongly rejects. Anthropocentrism, Jamieson says, is moderate, Elliot is clear that it is anthropocentric. Moral psychology, he says it is central, the other talks about it as minimal. Individual responsibility, for one it is strong emphasis, for the second it is less. Collective action, central problem, Elliot, it is not the core focus. Future generations, strong concern, Elliot affirmed but less developed. Nature's meaning, co-evolving with humans, Elliot, it is authentic, pre-human. View of harm, Jamieson, it is systematic, relational, for Elliot it is ontological laws. Policy of orientation, it is strong, limited. Environmental identity, fluid, original. Method of argument is cases plus analysis and thought experiments for the other. Scientific engagement is very high for Jamieson and moderate for Elliot. Historical dimension, it's climate change history and landscape history. Ethics of uncertainty, Jamieson talks about in a major theme, Elliot, it's a minor theme. Moral progress, it is possible, Elliot says, not core theme. And human role, embedded actors for Jamieson. Potential destroyers for Elliot. Responsibility scope, it's global, for Elliot it is local landscapes. Restoration ecology view, it's constructive tool, Elliot talks about it as fake nature. Conservation view is pragmatic, for Elliot it is purist. About the Anthropocene stance, for Jamieson it is central, for Elliot it is not emphasized. Emotions in ethics important, Elliot minimal. Reasoning style, pragmatic pluralism for the former, for the latter it is conceptual rigor. Normativity, it is forward looking and backward looking or history for Elliot. Key contribution for Jamieson is climate ethics, for Elliot it is authenticity and restoration critique. And the key critique for Jamieson, it's overtly anthropocentric, for Elliot it is purist and anti-restoration rigidity. So we see that now that when we sum up the final philosophical synthesis, Jamieson provides an ethics for the Anthropocene, which is flexible, human, interdisciplinary, bridging theory and global policy. On the other hand, Elliot defends a metaphysical or metaphysics of nature, which is authenticity, originality, and the irreplaceable value of wilderness. Together, they frame two poles of contemporary environmental philosophy. So, as the last words, Jamieson's question would be, how ought we act in an altered world? For Elliot, it would be, why is the original nature morally and ontologically irreplaceable? With this, we come to an end with the discussion of the two environmental ethicists of Jamieson and Elliot. We will be discussing more such environmental ethicists in our next class. Thank you so much.